I was still learning how to live alone when someone knocked who shouldn't have known my husband's name. She stood on my porch with a wedding photo in her hands, Robert in a suit I'd never seen, next to a woman who wasn't me. The house had learned new rhythms since I'd been alone, softer ones, sadder ones. I opened the door, expecting maybe the postman or Mrs. Henderson with another casserole I wouldn't eat. Instead, I found myself staring at a woman about my age, maybe younger, with graying hair pulled back and eyes that held something I couldn't name yet. The morning light behind her made her seem almost ethereal, like she'd stepped out of one of those half-remembered dreams I'd been having since Robert died. Dreams where he was trying to tell me something important, but I could never quite hear the words. She asked if I was Elizabeth Carter, her voice careful, like she was handling glass that might shatter if she spoke too loudly. I nodded, pulling my robe tighter around me. The silk was one Robert had bought me for our 30th anniversary, deep burgundy with tiny flowers that reminded him of the garden we'd planned, but never quite finished. Something about the way this stranger stood there, shifting her weight from foot to foot, made my chest tighten with a familiar anxiety. She told me her name was Patricia Williams, that she needed to talk to me about Robert. The sound of his name in a stranger's mouth felt wrong, intrusive, like she had no right to those syllables that still echoed in every corner of my house, in every room where his absence sat like unwelcome furniture. When I asked what about Robert, she glanced down at her hands, then back at my face, and asked if she could come in. Said this wasn't something for the porch, and I knew immediately that whatever she carried was heavy enough to change things. I stepped aside because something in her expression reminded me of myself 35 years ago, when I was trying to tell Robert things I could barely admit to myself. The same careful fear, the same way of holding words like they might explode. We sat in my living room, surrounded by Robert's books and the photos from our travels. She kept looking at the mantelpiece where our wedding picture sat next to the ceramic vase he bought me in Charleston, next to the small silver frame holding a photo of the puppy we'd had for exactly 3 weeks before I developed allergies we didn't know I had. She pulled out a wedding photo before I could refuse. Robert, in a navy suit I'd never seen, his arm around this woman in simple white. "We were married 12 years ago," she said, "in Virginia. We have a son." The words hit me like ice water. A son. The child I'd spent 35 years grieving, praying for, crying over in empty rooms when the longing became too much to bear. She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. A wedding photo. Robert in a suit I'd never seen, navy blue instead of the black he'd worn when we married, standing next to this woman in a simple white dress that looked nothing like my own elaborate gown from 1989. My hands started shaking before I even took the picture. The trembling started in my fingertips and worked its way up my arms, into my shoulders, until my whole body felt like it was vibrating with a frequency I couldn't control. I managed to ask when, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. 12 years ago, she said, in Virginia. The words came out smaller and smaller, like she was disappearing even as she spoke them. She told me Robert had said I couldn't know because it would destroy me, that I'd been through enough. The photograph felt heavier than it should have in my hands. Robert's smile was the same one I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago, the one that had convinced me to marry him after knowing him for only 8 months. But it was pointed at someone else now, at a life I didn't know existed, a love I'd never suspected. I studied every detail of that photograph like it was evidence in a crime I didn't understand yet. The way he stood, slightly angled toward her. The hand placement, protective and possessive in a way that was utterly familiar. The background, some courthouse or city hall I'd never seen, with windows that let in light that had never touched my skin. Patricia whispered that there was more, and I looked up from the photo, though everything in me wanted to keep staring at this impossible version of my husband, this Robert who existed outside the boundaries of everything I thought I knew about our life together. She told me they had a son, Michael, 15 years old. The words hit me like cold water, shocking and complete. A son. The child I'd spent decades wishing for, praying for, crying over in bathroom stalls and empty bedrooms when the longing became too much to carry in public. The child Robert and I never had, sitting heavy between us like a stone neither of us could move or mention without bleeding. I thought about all those years of trying, the hope that built and shattered month after month, the doctor's visits that became routine, then painful, then finally pointless. The way Robert would hold me when I cried, telling me we were enough, just the two of us, that we didn't need anyone else to make our family complete. But apparently, we did need someone else. Or he did. I asked if the boy knew about me, and Patricia shook her head. Robert kept everything separate, she explained. 2 different worlds, 2 different versions of himself. But when he got sick, he started talking about me, about how much he loved me, about how sorry he was. The words settled into my chest like stones. He never told me he was sick, I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to myself. She explained that he didn't want me to watch him die twice, and I understood then that Robert had been protecting me even as he was betraying me, even as he was living a life that made our entire marriage feel like a beautiful lie. I set the photograph on the coffee table between us, face down, because I couldn't bear to see Robert's happiness directed at someone else for another second. My hands were still shaking, and I pressed them flat against my thighs to make them stop. Patricia asked why she was telling me this now, her voice breaking slightly on the words. She said Michael deserved to know his father had love in his life, real love, and she thought I deserved to know too, after all this time of grieving someone who was only half real to me. The house felt too quiet suddenly, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do with this information that changed everything and nothing at the same time. I thought about all those business trips to Virginia, all those nights I'd lain awake wondering why Robert seemed restless in his sleep, why he sometimes muttered names I didn't recognize in his dreams. All those times I'd caught him staring into space with an expression I couldn't read, like he was seeing something or someone that wasn't there. All those years he'd come home from Virginia with small gifts, little tokens that seemed chosen too carefully. The scarf with the pattern, he said, reminded him of me. The book of poetry he claimed he'd picked up at random. The way he'd sometimes smell faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, and when I asked, he'd say it was from hugging a colleague goodbye. Now I knew what that expression was. Guilt. Love. The weight of living 2 lives and doing justice to neither. How many times had he sat in this very chair, looking at me across the dinner table, knowing he was keeping half his heart in another state with another family? How many times had he kissed me goodnight while thinking about a son who was growing up without him during the week, a boy who probably waited for his father's weekend visits like Christmas morning? I asked if he loved Patricia, and her face crumpled slightly before she composed herself and told me he loved me first, loved me most, that he made that very clear. But yes, in his way, he loved them too. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Robert had planted for me 3 springs ago. The roses he'd chosen were blooming now, red and white and pink, like they didn't know the man who put them there was gone. Like they didn't know he'd been tending other gardens, planting other seeds, nurturing other beautiful things in places I'd never seen. The morning light was getting stronger now, turning the dew on the rose petals into tiny diamonds. Robert used to bring me coffee, and we'd stand at this window together, planning what we'd plant next, what corner of the yard we'd tackle when spring came. He'd always talked about adding a swing set someday, just in case. Now I wondered if that someday had already happened, somewhere else, for someone else. I told Patricia I'd spent 35 years thinking I wasn't enough, thinking if I could just give him a child, if I could just be more, do more, maybe the sadness that sometimes crept into his eyes would disappear forever. She said I was enough, that what he did wasn't about what I lacked. It was about what he couldn't live with. When I asked what she meant, she told me about the way I'd looked when the doctors said I couldn't have children, how Robert had described that moment to her once, said it broke something in him that he couldn't fix. So he tried to fix it the only way he knew how, somewhere else, with someone else. But he never stopped loving me for it. The tears came then, finally. Not the angry tears I'd expected, but something deeper, sadder. The tears of a woman who'd spent 6 months grieving a man she thought she knew completely, only to find out he'd been grieving too, in ways she never imagined. I cried for the Robert who'd held me while I sobbed about our empty house, knowing he had another house that wasn't empty at all. I cried for the version of myself who'd spent decades feeling like a failure as a woman, not knowing my husband had found a way to father a child after all. I cried for the boy named Michael who'd lost his father and didn't even know he had a stepmother who would have loved him if she'd been allowed to. I sat back down across from Patricia and asked her to tell me about Michael. Her face softened for the first time since she'd walked through my door, and she described a boy who had Robert's laugh and his way of listening like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the world. She told me he played piano, that Robert was teaching him. The piano. Robert had always talked about getting lessons, about having music in the house again like when he was a child, but we'd never had the time, never had the reason, or so I thought. Now I knew why the subject always made him look wistful, why he'd sometimes hum melodies I didn't recognize. I heard myself say I wanted to meet Michael, and Patricia's eyes widened with something that might have been hope or fear. I wasn't sure about anything anymore, but I was tired of living in the spaces between Robert's silences. I was tired of loving a ghost when there were living pieces of him still walking around in the world, breathing and laughing and playing piano in a house I'd never seen. I told Patricia that when Robert died, I thought I'd lost everything. The future we'd planned, the past we'd shared, all of it. I looked at this woman who'd shared my husband's heart in ways I was still trying to understand, and realized maybe I hadn't lost everything. Maybe some parts of him were still here, still growing, still loving in ways I'd never been allowed to witness. Patricia nodded through her tears and said Robert would have wanted that, would have wanted me to know Michael, to know there was still love growing from what he left behind. I picked up the photograph from the coffee table and looked at it again. This time, instead of seeing betrayal, I saw the face of a man trying to carry more love than one life could hold. A man who'd made impossible choices and lived with impossible consequences, who'd protected one family by creating another, who died carrying secrets that were meant to spare the people he loved from the truth of how complicated love could be. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about deciding whether Robert was right or wrong. Maybe it was about deciding whether love was bigger than the mistakes we make while trying to protect it. I asked Patricia to tell me about the piano lessons, and for the first time since she'd knocked on my door, she smiled.